Kia ora koutou, welcome to the Happy Revolution podcast. This week on the podcast, myself and my co-host Mika interview Dr. Bethany Sollereder. Bethany is a lecturer in science and religion at the University of Edinburgh and has written many articles and 2 books, including the first ever Choose Your Own Theological adventure book called Why Is There Suffering? Pick Your Own Theological Expedition. We chat with Bethany about the intersections between science and religion and the morality of pain and theologies of suffering within the Christian tradition. A friend of ours, Mary Hutchinson, who was previously a GP but now works as a chaplain at Massey, was also in the room during this interview and at times joins in with the conversation, which was really wonderful. Bethany was only in the country for a few weeks, and we had met her the day before we recorded this interview after a lecture that she gave, which we referenced throughout the interview. So we're really grateful that she said yes to coming and chatting with us, because she had literally just met us, but she was really lovely and kind, and we're very thankful for that.
Well, thank you, Bethany, for coming and joining us, taking time out of your short amount of time in New Zealand to spend some time with students at Vic. We thought we would start by asking about science and religion, and just ask that sort of basic question of, is science and religion compatible? Which I understand has a myriad of different answers.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you've preempted me there. That's exactly where I would go, is that it depends what you mean by science and religion. Those are terms that have changed in their use over the centuries that they've been used. So Peter Harrison's brilliant book, Territories in Science and Religion, really sort of shapes how those went from inner dispositions to sort of objective institutions, almost bodies of knowledge and processes of seeing the world. And so if you're asking that question historically, it's going to depend how people at that time were using those words. So even the word scientist wasn't coined until 1833 by William Whewell. And some of the alternative ideas for what you might call a scientist, my favorite was nature poker, which I think is just, there was a lost opportunity there. Somebody like Ian Barber has these 4 sort of famous models. So he says that people could relate them by seeing them as basically in conflict. And that's a view that somebody like Thomas Henry Huxley would have brought up. Certainly, you know, the new atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, etc. It's also a view that's held by quite a lot of Christians. So if you read some of the people like Ken Ham, who works in Answers in Genesis, he again is going to say that the scripture stands against science. Now he'll say that scripture has its own science, so they're pro-science as long as it's creation science and the science that the Bible says, but the sort of typical mainstream science they'd see as in conflict. But many other people would take different views on that. So you might have, the second of Barber's categories is the idea of independence, that they really should not have anything to do with each other. So someone like Stephen Jay Gould advocated for that with his non-overlapping magisteria, or NOMA. And he just said, let scientists get on with their work, and we'll let you religious people do your thing, and everyone will be happy for that. The third and fourth of Barber's categories, the ideas of integration and of dialogue, I think are probably more representative of what the majority of the history of science and religion were, where faith was an inspiration for science, or where faith brought up and directed science. So again, how do we know what to look at in the world? Well, Francis Bacon, when he set out sort of what we should be doing, he said that it's to sort of investigate the works of God, but also for the relief of suffering of people. So the sort of orientation of science was really oriented around his faith position. I think that those are examples of dialogue that we see carried on in somebody like Francis Collins today, who was the head of the Human Genome Project and the head of scientific funding in the States, but is a deep evangelical Christian trying to work out how science and faith relate to each other day to day.
Of those 4 different models, is there one that you find most compelling? And
I think
why?
Yeah, I think the majority of the time I'm somewhere in the dialogue thing that science has a lot to learn from sort of religious wisdom and vice versa. That religion has a lot to learn from the investigations of the world. That I think theology should have as wide-ranging a catch for data as it possibly can, and that inevitably includes the sciences. But I think that it kind of depends on the question you ask. So I think that there are questions you could ask which would inevitably lead to a conflict view. So if you say God created humans in a moment, and then you put that into conversation with science, you will have a conflict. But I think that there are other ways to read the Bible that don't cause that kind of conflict. I think similarly, there are proper places for independence. So the idea that God created out of nothing has often been seen as a support for Big Bang Theory, that there was a beginning in time. But I think that that's actually not a proper understanding of that doctrine. I think you could have, as they thought in the early church, that the world was probably eternal. So if you had eternal multiverse, for example, or you had what was believed up until Georges Lemaitre with the steady state universe, I think those are perfectly compatible with God creating out of nothing, because God creating out of nothing is actually a statement of the dependence of creation on God to be what it is, to not fall into non-existence. So God did create out of nothing, continuously creates out of nothing, and that could be brought into conversation with the expanding and contracting universe that happens over and over and over again, with multiverse, with Big Bang as the beginning of time altogether. It actually doesn't matter which cosmological view you have, you can have that sort of view of the world. And so I think in all of that, you have a reasonable case for independence. I'm going to say it just really comes down to the kind of question you're asking. And I think you could also ask really ridiculous questions. What does God have to say about the chemistry of cheese making? And there's just probably not a whole lot there. I think asking good questions is probably half the battle.
How can evolution be viewed in light of the biblical story and the creation story?
It's a really good question. So how do we read Genesis in light of the creation story? The question you almost have to ask before that is, what kind of text is Genesis? Is it a history text? Is it trying to teach us science? And one of the interesting things is that we actually have two creation stories. We have Genesis 1, the sort of 6 days of creation, then God resting. And then right after that, in Genesis 2:4, you have a completely different narrative of creation where God creates everything in a day. And it actually says in the Hebrew, in the day God created the heavens and the earth. In translations, they often sort of gloss over that. They put when God created rather than in the day, because in the day is a Hebrew euphemism. You could mean sort of like in the day of horse and carriage, or you could mean in the day last Tuesday. So it's not entirely a thing, but it is sort of playing with the Hebrew text to make it sound like it could be saying the same thing as Genesis 1, but instead you have a completely different order. Humans are created first, then plants are created, then animals are created. The early church, long before evolution was around, people like Augustine said, look, the fact that we have these two very different stories is actually evidence that we shouldn't take them as literally historical. Even in his book, The Literal Interpretation of Genesis, he's saying, yeah, literal, but not quite, not quite that far. And so in unwinding that, then we say, okay, should we expect to find evolution in the Bible? And again, I think the answer is no, that this is a book written for everyone of all ages, but not necessarily to everyone of all ages. And we see in those Genesis narratives a real reflection of the ancient Near Eastern culture that it was written in. I would say we don't find evolution in the Bible, just as I would say we don't see modern astronomy in the Bible. So in Genesis 1, it describes the moon as a light. a great light in the sky. But it's, of course, not a light. It reflects light from the sun. It's the great mirror in the sky, not a light itself. But that's not reflected in the text. So if we wanted to poke holes in the scientific accuracy, it would be pretty easy, And even John Calvin, in his commentary on Genesis, kind of says, the moon is called the Great Light, but we all know Saturn is much bigger than the moon. So how come Saturn isn't mentioned? Because it's even a bigger one, And he says, look, you're asking for the wrong thing. It's written from a sort of perspective that everybody could understand without having advanced knowledge of the sciences. So I think if we take that sort of view of the text, it frees us up to be able to accept science on its own terms as a description of the history of this world in a scientific way rather than a theological way. And then what we do with the text is we say, what does this tell us about our relationship with God, our relationship with other creatures, our relationship with people, about what's gone wrong in the world? All those things we can still get from the text. And the character of God is amazing in these texts. Have you read any of the other ancient Near Eastern creation narratives?
I've read a couple when I was in Bible college, although I can't quite remember. But they were brutal. I remember them being brutal.
Yeah. So I think the Epic of Atrahasis, creation is made out of a huge conflict between Marduk, the great god, and Tiamat. Marduk fights against Tiamat, and when he kills her, he cuts her body in half and makes the heavens out of one half of her and the earth out of the other. There's often these things, or the earth is the battlefield of the gods, and that's why things are bad. You have one Egyptian myth where one of the gods masturbates and creates the heavens and earth out of the sperm. So you've got these sort of fertility and battle myths, and the Christian. Well, I shouldn't say the Christian, the Hebrew. The Hebrew notion is really being put up in contraposition to that. So it's saying, no, we're not a result of the battle. We're not the result of an accident. Another Egyptian myth, the great god sends out his third eye and it gets lost. And so he cries because he's lost his eye. And the tears, when they hit the ground, become humans. Right? So humans are really made as an accident out of the lament of the gods, or humans are made as the slaves of the gods. And so in all those things, you have this radically different view where God provides for people a good place and intentionally. And so I think those are rich ways to read the text, but we shouldn't expect to see evolution in there.
I really want to ask you why you are so interested in questions of religion and science. Why this particular topic?
Oh, yeah. I fell into it by accident, really. I was at home one day. I'd been enrolled in a master's program, actually in history. And so I was at home, not doing anyone any harm. And my father came home. He's a GP with a business card from one of his patients who had done a master's degree at the same place at Regent College of Vancouver. And my dad said, this patient, he has gone to Regent. He wondered if you'd want to talk to him about, going there. And I thought, that sounds good. Turns out he was the local professor of science and religion at the University of Alberta, Dennis Lamoureux. And he came out with a book called Evolutionary Creation. And at the time, it was still in process. And he asked me to read it as a sort of test reader. So he'd give me a couple chapters, and then we'd meet together and argue for hours, and then he'd give me a few more chapters, we'd argue. And prior to that, I was like, science and religion, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. It's just two scientists yelling at each other. Totally uninteresting. But what Dennis's book did was show me how this was really a question about how we interpret the Bible. And that I cared about. So all the rest kind of came out of that really accidental conversation. Otherwise, I'd be a historian right now.
That is very cool.
So to talk then about evil and suffering, very big topics. One question that kind of follows on from the evolution thing is that if one justification, I guess, for suffering and for pain has often been humans were there at the beginning in the literal creation story, the failure of humans to obey God leads to all of these curses and all of this suffering. But if we're not reading Genesis literally and instead taking an evolutionary view, then there must have been suffering and death before there were humans.
Mm-hmm.
How do we then explain why there is suffering and death and evil in the world?
Good. Well, I'm really grateful for a small question this early in the morning. So I think you're absolutely right that the way that it is explained in the Bible and in Paul in particular is he just sort of blames Adam. And I think actually Paul is probably drawing more from sort of intertestamental writings than he is from Genesis, because his reading is not an obvious reading of Genesis. But there are a few different ways that people do account for it. So if you have somebody like Michael Lloyd or Paul Griffiths, C.S. Lewis, they say that really the way to explain that is to solve that chronological problem that death and suffering and extinction were around long before humans were around to sin. They still want to say it's because of sin, and so they look to Satan and other spiritual powers. Say, there are places where you have God fighting with leviathans and sort of creatures, and Jesus talks about principalities and powers, and so they would say that it's probable that those creatures have upset the evolutionary process from the beginning. I don't like that a huge amount. First, because the Bible keeps going on about how good creation is. It's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good. And that's the completed creation, presumably with things like beasts of the field, which is a Hebrew euphemism for predatorial animals, right there in Genesis 1. And the Leviathan is another of the creatures that's specifically mentioned in Genesis 1 as one of the creations of God. And then you look through, say, the divine dialogues in Job, and God is pointing out with glee all the most problematic parts of creation as special points of pride. Have you seen my storehouses full of hail? Have you seen the great, the Leviathan and the behemoth which I have made? So I'm less likely to go down that road and blame it on Satan. But that really leaves me in a tricky spot, because it means that the suffering, the death, these were part of God's toolbox, not accidents in creation. Now, I can say that, and then I can take that back a little bit and say, if we think that God created a world which has autonomy, we can extend the sort of free will argument to the non-human world. So we can, to some extent, say creatures also chose their own ways of living. And therefore, not every instance of predation, not every instance of parasitism is what God designed to be the case, but it came about through the free action of creatures. You could also say things like, for the majority of time life has been on Earth, there's not been suffering. Life started 4.1 billion years ago, and for billions of years, bacteria wandered the oceans happily, swapping their DNA, reproducing. There was no suffering. There was death, but probably wasn't problematic to them. And so you have these vast amounts of times, whereas suffering is really a late emerger on the scene of life, and it comes with more complicated animals, more complicated central nervous systems, but it also comes with things we really value, like the ability to feel pleasure, the ability to have memory, the ability to enjoy, the ability to love. It doesn't seem like we can have those things without at least the possibility of suffering, just from a physical standpoint. And so if you sort of see pain and suffering as evolutionary mechanisms that were selected for because they're an advantage to the creatures who suffer, then you have at least a mediated picture. So one of the things I like to sort of play with is, do you know about leprosy? Yeah. So leprosy, now called Hansen's disease, is a bacterial infection, kills the pain nerves, and people damage themselves. Put their hands in fires, walk on broken limbs, all those things, because they don't feel pain. They don't take proper care of themselves. Now, we don't know that what they called leprosy in the New Testament, if that was Hansen's disease or not. It's probably a word that was used for a variety of skin conditions, etc. But if any of them had leprosy, if any of them had real Hansen's disease, Jesus healing them was giving their pain back, not taking it away. And that's, I think, a really interesting insight.
I can see that point about not wanting to outsource creation and, in some ways, evolution to demons, because it seems like a lot of that has led to humans being alive and around. But it still raises the question for me of why, to make all of what is made through evolution, why would God choose such a painful and rough way of doing that involves so much death and so much suffering, both for animals and for humans?
If suffering has some really necessary and important parts to it, why are we so concerned with it still? Why are humans obsessed with trying to get rid of it?
So I think the first one about sort of why use such a process, I'm probably there with somebody like Chris Southgate, who kind of says this may be the only way. You know, that once you have people and giraffes and pandas, they can inhabit heaven, which, you know, because that sort of leads to the question, well, why didn't God just create heaven first? You know, if we're going to this better place, there's no suffering, no pain, why not do that? And I think that the answer is something along the lines of that to create people, you need, and to create them with a sense of them creating themselves and not just being a robot made by divine design. We need something of freedom in the process. And I think one of the ways that in the last few hundred years the church has kind of misimagined God is we've become obsessed with God as the engineer, as the architect, as the one who creates by controlling. Whereas I think God is a parent. God is the one who creates and then shapes, influences, forms, but is ultimately the one who gives away power and gives away agency and gives away in the way that parents have a lot of control, but not that much even over newborn babies, you know, but then their work is to let go more and more and more. So I think if you look at creation as, and you know, creatures as children of God rather than as products of God, you get a very different view on that. Why are we so obsessed with suffering?
Why do we consider it immoral? Like, we bring morality into it.
Yeah, so I think that humans have a particular unique place in creation for that. So I think that we are obsessed with suffering because it's very unpleasant, because it is very damaging. And part of that is going to be just the evolutionary, we don't want to die, you know, which is right and good. But I think that there's also a way that those desires get distorted by sin so that we never want to die, you know, and there's all sorts of things about the problems of desiring immortality. If you people like podcasts, there's one called Mistakes Were Made, which is an episode of This American Life, where they look at the cryogenics movement of people trying to freeze themselves at the point of death so that they can be revived later. And it's kind of just this tragi-comedy of errors of the way that our pursuit of everlasting life is actually in this world in this way is problematic. And so I think humans, our whole experience of suffering is affected by sin, which I don't think is the case for non-human animals. So our experience of suffering is really different from what it should be, and our experience of death is different from what it should be. And I think that we get a glimpse of what it might be in the saints and the martyrs, people who have a really different approach to suffering than most of us.
The piece about the martyrs having a different experience. Can you unpack that a wee bit more?
Yeah.
Please.
So, I mean, some of the martyrs kind of looked for martyrdom in ways that I think are problematic. You know, there was sort of a glorification of that. But I'm thinking of like Perpetua and Felicita, two Roman martyrs who were able to face death with just an amazing courage and hope. I think of some of these saints, somebody like Francis of Assisi, who had a really bad eye condition for years and yet used it as a way to sort of refine his soul. Julian of Norwich is another great example of somebody. And I mean, there's probably something a bit problematic of her asking God to kind of strike her to the point of death. But at the same time, she's somebody who was able to take her suffering and transform it into good. And so the visual image that comes to mind with me is sort of a hammer hitting iron. That hammer can be something that becomes very destructive, but it can be also the force that tempers, that makes good. Yeah. And so humans in particular, in a way that I don't think is available to the animal world, can influence which way the hammer strikes of suffering affect us. We can choose to turn the destructive thing into something that shapes and forms by our response. And that's a heavy and terrible thing. And I think it also is something that needs to be chosen from the inside, from the person themselves. They have to make that choice. Somebody going up to them saying, you could really use this for good is terrible, right? So I'm not advocating that. Yeah. But there's something in the Christian tradition that says we can see suffering as a really redemptive thing if we so choose. And that's easy to say as we're sitting comfortably sipping coffee. It might be different in a different thing. But some of these historic figures have been through real suffering. The Black Plague, other, and still found that to be true. And I think that witness deserves to be listened to.
How do you balance that with still striving, like we all do, we're all activists, striving for social and transformation and social justice, which is the act of attempting to eliminate suffering in a particular way?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that comes up. And I think that, yeah, you're right. You could just say, if suffering's good, let's get rid of medicine and, and actually that was an argument that was often used in the American South, that actually slavery is good for people because it gave them the chance to build their character. And that wasn't even just a historical argument. That's one that Richard Swinburne makes in his book on suffering. He actually says, God gave unlimited choices to people through this, that slaves could be patient and in their, and I literally took his book and threw it at the wall, which I don't think I've ever done before or since with the book, because I was just so disgusted by this. So I think, again, there's a difference between me saying, how do I respond to my suffering? And what am I happy to let be imposed on other people, right? I think that's a really big difference. And so, again, I would say that view of suffering being something productive is something that has to be inhabited from the inside, from the person. I also think, though, that our aims in activism have to come with discernment. So you could see the opioid crisis in the States as a good example of where the only aim was get rid of pain as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And that's led to a huge amount more suffering. So I don't think that our goal should ever be relieve suffering. I think our goal should be towards wholeness, towards justice, towards mercy, towards health. But I think we have become over-focused on all suffering is bad. And so what we do is other people hurt me in a social situation, I retreat into my tribe, into my echo chamber, right? Rather than saying, they caused me great offense. Let's see how we can find healing in this situation. Sometimes goodness, truth, justice come through pushing through suffering, not avoiding it. And so that's not my most controversial opinion, but it's probably close that we've become overly focused on just avoiding suffering and eliminating it in ways that are not wise.
Do you have any thoughts as a doctor from a medical perspective?
It's very refreshing to hear this. I mean, it's refreshing and it's painful, I think, really, because you do walk that line. Because, for instance, if you're needing to tell somebody that they have an awful condition, disease kind of thing, of course you'd much rather not tell them that. And they may or may not want to hear it. Or that can be a journey, obviously. But you also have to, you kind of have to let let stuff go and be, and realise your limitations in health or healthcare or whatever. Elimination of suffering as the only goal is a distortion. But it's we can only speak about ourselves, our own experience, and those very close to us, really, or people we've walked with or are walking with who are on roads of difficulty, which everyone is, of course, to some degree. To me, it's more humanising and more thoroughgoing and more walking alongside as Jesus, God, does with us, to be real, rather than to say, well, I'll pray for that and that will deal with it. So that's a little bit getting into another area of questioning, because, I do believe in miraculous healing. However, it's just constantly having that, okay, you can be healed, is only part of the story, and it's not a respectful part, I don't feel, if that is your kind of pound, and then it invokes guilt in the person, potentially, because, well, why aren't I healed? So I don't have enough faith, or, blah, 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 or the prayer wasn't spiritual enough, or those sorts of dilemmas. So I don't know whether that's something that you...
I didn't have the right healer pray for me.
Exactly.
Or, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't pray enough times.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of taking the focus off being human, which is to me, our ultimate goal through Jesus.
Yeah, and again, another of my controversial opinions, if God did create evolution, then I think it means God always intended humans to physically die. Not that they were meant to die spiritually, and so our experience of death is again distorted, because we die for the wrong reasons, war, for example, but we also die in the wrong sort of spiritual place. And so I think that there is a proper Christian acceptance of physical death that, again, our culture has really lost sight of. And if you look at the history of religious writings, there are so many accounts of what a good death looks like. There's whole Victorian devotional literatures about the good death of children, right? Which is, we just go like, oh my goodness, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot barge pole. But I think our absolute aversion to the idea that death can be a good experience of being embraced by Jesus and moving into paradise is one of the places where our particular culture has a theological blind spot.
Can I just expand on the idea of distortion a little bit through war and stuff? That seems to suggest that there's some sort of suffering and evil that's through evolution and part of the way things are, but then also some ways in which human choice and human agency sort of adds to that evil and makes it more evil than it should be. Is that...
That's exactly right. So I have this whole sort of story that God wanted to create creatures who could love, right? And love is a combination of desires, the desire for the good of the beloved and the desire for union with the beloved. And if you want to know more about that, read Eleanor Stump's Wandering in Darkness. Great book. And so evolutionary progress, evolutionary development created a number of desires. Desires for security, desires for pleasure, desires for food, desires for community, all these mixed desires. And at one point, God begins to communicate with humans, begins to put a call on their life to take those evolutionary desires and transform them into the desires of love. And so you could think of it taking like barley and sugar and hops and brewing them into beer. You know, what barley was really meant to be, but does not exist in nature, right? This is a product of human culture, but it needs those basic ingredients. And so I think God is at work brewing in our souls, fermenting these desires into something entirely new, which is the desire of love. But humans can oppose that process. We can ruin that fermenting process. And then what you get is not nearly as good as the barley and the hops and the yeast and the sugar are. You get something that's just a complete mess. So I think that's exactly right, that humans can add cruelty, can add hatred, things that we don't see in the non-human animal world, because we oppose God's work of turning desires into love, and we turn them into evil.
Do we not see cruelty and hatred in the non-human world? I feel like sometimes.
What about like cats playing with mice?
Or like creatures that kill for the sake of it, rather than for food.
Yeah, so there would be somebody like David Clough and Celia Dean Drummond would disagree with me on this. So they would say that, when we see a chimpanzee killing a mate's or a rival's baby and then eating it, cannibalizing it, that is sin, and that is unjust cruelty. And there's actually, I think it's Jane Goodall, kind of talks about watching this happening. One female killing a rival's baby and beginning to eat it with her babies. And a third female comes over to kind of join the meal, and then seems like she realizes what's happened and sort of walks off in disgust, sort of wipes off her hands and refuses to eat this meat. I would say that what we have is a complexity of those evolutionary desires, but because there's no call of God for them to become the desires of love, that there's not a ruining of that process either. You're just getting sort of the extremes of the natural evolutionary desires. So I would say it's not, yeah. And I mean, I've worked with horses enough and they can really hold a grudge, It's partially a definitional thing for me. Do we have violence? Do we have grudges? Do we have cats playing with mice? I don't know whether that's cruelty or whether it's a lack of empathetic imagination. Does the cat know that the other one is suffering? I don't think so. I think it would happily pursue a feather toy just as much as it pursues the mouse. So again, I would say probably not cruelty. And where I really get into trouble is when I say probably not love either. Your dog has great affection for you, but doesn't love you. Still not my most controversial opinion.
Well, I did want to ask on that then, that seems to imply that these things that you're mentioning as part of that fermenting process, compassion, love, mercy, justice, are all things that we need suffering to develop. Is that accurate?
Yeah,
Or suffering needs to be something that
Or
exists.
even evil, yeah.
Sure.
So I think suffering exists, again, because it's an evolutionary advantage. I think suffering, sort of emotional pain, if I can put it that way, serves the same function socially that physical pain does. So physical pain tells me not to hit the table too hard. Emotional pain tells me how I need to live in cooperation with other people. Are they necessary for love and for courage? I don't know. That would be the view of somebody like Irenaeus, the early church father. So he kind of says the reason God put us through all of this is that love can't simply be inserted. It has to be developed. It has to be grown. So I think here we go. I think it needs challenge. I don't think it needs evil, if I can put it that way. So could humans have made different choices that meant that they were unfallen? Yes, and we see that in Jesus. But it still tells us in Hebrews that he had to learn and grow the way all of us do. And I think that happens in being challenged and coming up against obstacles and learning to overcome them. But I think things like physical danger, which I still think would have been present, would have been enough without evil. I might be wrong.
Speaking of Jesus, I feel like any time Christians ever talk about suffering, it always comes back to Jesus. And I don't really know what my question is here, but how does the crucifixion fit into this whole conversation? And my personal frustration. I love the idea. I do find a lot of hope in the idea of a suffering God, but also I think sometimes it's a bit of a cop-out for Christians. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what my question is, but...
Yeah.
What do you mean by a bit of a cop-out?
I think what you said in your lecture the other day of if I go to the doctor with a broken arm, I don't want to see my doctor with a broken arm, just as a way of solidarity. Like, that's not what I'm after. I'm after healing and transformation and wholeness. So I think that sometimes it can be a cop-out in that way.
Yeah. That oh, well, God suffers with us, so we don't have anything more to expect from God. God's really done everything, right? Yeah, and I talked about that, but I also sort of added that there's that view of God that's a little bit like Lord Farquaad from Shrek. Right, so you'll remember he's arranging all the knights because he doesn't want to go rescue Princess Fiona himself, and he says, I'm going to send you off, and if the dragon kills you, we'll just send the next person. And he says, some of you may die, but that is a risk I am willing to take, And so the suffering God, at the very least, gets rid of that idea that's how God relates to creation. Standing above it, not suffering, and being like, I have all these wonderful plans for you. You're really going to suffer for them, but I'm fine with that. Yeah. So the cross at least tells us that God suffers with us in every way that we do, that there's no suffering that God has volunteered us for, that God doesn't stand beside us in and fully experience. I think the other thing, and I mentioned this as well, the idea of a cruciform creation, that there's something about the journey of Jesus through suffering and death to resurrection and new life that is an interesting parallel, an interesting resonance with the way that life finds new life after death, through death. So we eat one another and flourish, and, in decay, there's new life that springs up. Something devastating like a wildfire also brings up the renewal of the forest. And so there's something of that death leading to life. And Bertolt Brecht, the playwright, talked about the motto of hell is eat or be eaten. The motto of heaven is eat and be eaten. So there's this idea of sort of a self-giving at the heart, where we each of us give ourselves to the other as we also are given to by other creatures.
I've heard it said many times that when you look at the crucifix, you are looking at eternity. How does suffering and pain fit into eternity? Is it completely gone? Is there elimination of suffering and elimination of pain? But then that quote kind of points to no, maybe not. What do you imagine it to be transformed into when the new heaven and the new earth?
Here we get into real speculation.
Yeah, well, of course.
So as soon as you try and say, well, the second law of thermodynamics couldn't work, and then, what would our guts look like? What does my body look like if I'm not eating and if I'm not hosting the trillions of microbacteria that are there? And, do we eat, and will I have to poop in heaven? All these things to some extent are a bit of, they're interesting questions, but they can easily lead to absurd answers that actually just mislead further than just saying, I can't actually answer that. So we can think about times here where, think of if you're getting a really good massage where it just hurts so good, So there are possibilities that something like suffering will exist, where that challenge needed for the development of courage and joy and peace and love are there. That point when you're with somebody and the joy of being in their company, when you love them so much, it hurts in the best possible ways. So I could imagine all suffering being that kind of thing, the thing that C.S. Lewis called joy, which he said was a desire that is so deep and so painful, but it's much better than the fulfillment of any other desire. So could it be like that? Yeah, maybe. Maybe it'll just be totally different and we can't, Yeah. So I what I try and do is not answer a good question like that directly, because I'm afraid my answer will be absurd. We were talking about this last night, Mary. We were talking about if you're in the resurrection and you died as a baby, how old will you be? Or if you died decrepit at 106. And the traditional theological answer is you'll be 33. It's the age of Jesus, it's in the fullness of blah, 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 blah. But it's wrong. That's an absurd answer, right? It's trying to put an answer on something that you should just say, actually, it'll just be good. Yeah. And things like age won't really make sense in eternity. So I think we can kind of ask those questions, critique our asking of them, try and answer them anyways, critique our answering of them, and just say our trust is in the love of God, that it will be gloriously, unimaginably good.
Perhaps a more basic question about suffering and Jesus. So if suffering and evil are part of the world and something that is kind of in some ways for the greater good and develops us and forms us, why does Jesus heal people and resurrect people? Not just sort of let them.
So it's interesting. So I do think God is concerned about human suffering. I think what's interesting is there's always a social part to his healings. So he resurrects a little girl. He resurrects Lazarus when his sisters are utterly reliant upon his social ability to interact with the culture. They would have been orphaned, essentially, without him, unable to own land, unable to have money. What Jesus doesn't do is resurrect somebody who's at the end of their life and, has lived the good long years. And even with Lazarus and the little girl, they both presumably died later on. So there's revivification rather than resurrection in that sense. So resurrection is what happens at the end of time when death is defeated. Jesus gave them a continued life, but not eternal life in that act. And so I think that, again, with the questions of the healings, I think God is behind modern medicine. I don't think we should avoid modern medicine, but that always has to come with discernment. Because Jesus could have snapped his fingers and had everybody on earth healed of everything forever and didn't do that. And I think that that's just as important as saying, but God does care about the suffering of individuals and the wholeness that is brought to people. Again, socially, that's a context where if you had a physical disease, you were often socially ostracized. And that's no way to live. So it's interesting with the man who has paralysis. Is that the one where he says your sins are forgiven first and seems to be about to walk away until he's challenged?
Yeah.
And then he goes and does the physical healing? I think that's really, really an interesting story because, again, it's saying like the real thing that needs healing is not our bodies in this earth, but our souls and the way that our social structures. Physical healing is part of that, but it's never going to be forever. That will always wait for the other side of eternity.
Do you have thoughts, Mary?
As long as that doesn't go into a sort of like the body is lesser
No,
in
not at
terms
all.
of our humanness.
Yeah. That's helpful. Yeah, no, not at all.
Yeah.
No, it is important. Do your exercise. Do all those things, but don't hope for what isn't possible now. I guess. I do think that Christians should be involved in works of healing the body, and of course of avoiding having people live in conditions that are impossible to flourish in. I think human flourishing is a good. It's just that flourishing is wider than simple physical health, and that it's always going to be temporary at this point. The real flourishing, the full flourishing is something that will never happen fully here. Now I'm critiquing my own saying of that and going, Bethany, be careful. So,
in light of all the stuff we've discussed, particularly, I guess, this idea of like suffering as part of creation and that being, like Chris Southgate says, the way that things are. Where do you find hope? Where do you look for hope in all of that?
I look for a lot of hope in the ongoing work of God in the world. So I'm enough of a charismatic, no longer a classic Pentecostal, but enough of a charismatic that I think that God is constantly active in the world in large and small ways. And so looking for how God is at work and joining God's work in prayer and in, the various vocations we work out day to day. I'm constantly horrified by the extent of human evil, I'm constantly gobsmacked by the extent of human good, by the generosity of people, by their willingness to give up things that I think I'm not going to live without that, but people who are just great examples of goodness and are real inspirations of how we can live in more just ways and more holy ways. I also find hope in the sense that we are pilgrims and citizens of heaven. in a time when displacement is a rising concern, where long association with people in places is hard. I mean, my own life, I've moved around and around and around as an academic because of the brokenness of academic structures. And so having a sort of sense that, well, home is really found in the love of God and found in being a sort of pilgrim on this earth. Now that has a whole bunch of inherent dangers, that we don't seek justice and we don't seek connection here because we just are so heavenly minded that we're of no earthly good. So I want to sort of critique that even as I'm saying it, but I do think that we've sort of lost any real hope in heaven in sort of sophisticated Western theologies. We sort of give it lip service, but we don't live as if it's actually true. And I think that can be a loss.
That makes me a bit uncomfortable.
Good. Talk it out. Tell me about it.
Well, I grew up and went to Bible college in evangelical circles. And there's definitely, I think in reaction to, I don't even know if as I'm saying if it's right, but I think as a reaction against the old theology of the Catholic Church, very much emphasis on Jesus, the man who cared about how we live in the day-to-day, about money, and is concerned about how we use our body in various ways. And what I was intentionally retaught by my lecturers and people like that was that heaven is not the real concern for Christians. It's how we live now. And we shouldn't think about heaven too much because we don't really know what it is or what it's about. And our hope is in personal transformation now. So it would take a lot of work, I think, to reshape that towards considering heaven as an important source of hope.
So when you pray, your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, what does that mean to you?
That's a very good question, because we pray that every day in our morning prayers, that God's kingdom is present here and that we are working to bring it about. We are joining in with the work to bring it about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do agree with that. I think that is important. And I think there is a reasonable reaction in saying, and that's why I was critiquing it even as it was coming out, of saying that we've lost something, but if we swing back the other way too far, that's a problem too. So I went to an evangelical Bible college as well, but it was so like, we don't need to worry about social justice. All we need to worry about is souls getting to heaven. Yeah. And I think that's equally problematic. And so I'm trying to sort of say we've maybe gone too far where we can't even find a sense of motivation in the idea that God will make all things well. And that we've lost something in that, but we don't want to also go so far that we say bodies aren't important. We don't need to do that. And so I think in Aristotelian philosophy, virtue is always the mean, the middle between two vices. and so there's some wisdom in that, of kind of saying that Anglican middle way, not to show any personal biases, but I'm just kidding. But in most things we can find that an overemphasis or an underemphasis, and so it's just asking sort of, where is our culture? How can we learn from the history of the church where they've had other imbalances, and how can we try and find God in our present moment? And I've been told I'm a contrarian, so I've been told that, if everyone's saying something, I'm going to say the other thing just to say it. So that might be true too.
Yeah. You talked about God as the parent and how God forms us and gives us free will. Mika and I think Mary, in your lecture, were arguing about the tinkering God versus the actively involved God that fringes on free will. And I'm not really sure what my question is, but even the parent God can seem very distant and very removed from my personal circumstances and suffering in my in our social world. And I'm not really sure what my question is. I don't actually know what my question is.
Is it sort of how do we see God active?
Yeah.
If God's not actually like doing miracles, etc.
Yeah. And how much is God active and how much is God just tinkering?
Yeah.
Because the tinkering thing...
It seems like either God winds up the clock and then just lets creation run and is distant, or God is constantly always involved and just tinkering around to make suffering not as bad as it could be. and neither of those things felt really
appealing.
Yeah.
And the parent God has, when you first said it, I think it has initial relief from both those options, but still feels a bit distant. Like, I mean, like all of us, we're still angry at our parents sometimes.
Sure. Angry with God, if we're probably honest. Yeah. I think that we can't say God acts in just one way. I think we tend to want to say God does this and not that, and if we see it from the proper angle, you'll see God is always doing this in some version or form, and I just think that's a bit limiting, really. So I like a whole panoply of divine action views. So I recently spoke in California at the Center for Process Studies on God doing like the crassest form of interventionist miracle, which was absolutely a no-no in process theology crowds. Because I think that if people invite God to act, God does act. I think prayer is powerful, and I think that there is that. But I don't see that as God tinkering so much as God co-creating the world with human cooperation, that we cooperate together to create a world. I think that one of the things that I do pull from process theology is the idea of the divine lure. That rather than God sort of tinkering to create an outcome, God's constantly inviting. God's constantly, you can think of the gravitational effect of the sun on the earth. The sun just is. And everything is attracted to it. And so there's something about the beauty and the glory and the goodness of God that attracts creation, almost like an erotic love attraction to that goodness. And so I think that's one way that God is active in the world. I think God is active in the world by meaning making. Because I have a view of creation unfolding without God directing everything, that sometimes things happen that God didn't want, but that God will creatively work out creation afterwards in ways that make sense of that. So you can think, there was that point where I'm thinking maybe biographically, where that guy I really liked definitely rejected me, and it was, my life was over, there was no meaning, and then later on I got to know them better and thought, oh, I'm so glad that happened, right? Alternatively, there's the point where you got the thing you wanted, and then later you thought, oh, gosh, I wish that hadn't happened. I think there are ways that later developments help us reframe and reinterpret earlier experiences. And so I think God is continuously in that work of meaning making to make things that were senseless something that plays a part in sense after all. God will make the senseless make sense. Not by changing what happened, but by working on the meaning of what happened. And then the co-suffering, I think, is another way that we can see God at work. So I think that there's all these ways, and whether that's satisfactory or not, or how close we are. And I mean, at this point, this is also where I just go into full evangelical mode and charismatic mode of the Spirit of God indwelling us and walking with us and speaking to us and the charismatic gifts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of those ways of God being at work.
I'm satisfied.
Okay.
Thank you. A bit of a cheeky question that we always ask academics is, what is your most controversial opinion? Another way to phrase that would be, if you were in a room full of academics from your field or people from your field, what is something that you would most likely disagree with them about?
Okay. Now, we haven't talked about the field that I'm going to say this in, which is sort of the climate eco-theology field. Right. So, no, that's okay. I didn't give a lecture on this, but here is my most controversial view. Everyday environmentalism is the opiate of the peoples. Now, it's so controversial that I haven't actually said it out loud, so you're hearing it here first. And it's so controversial that I'm not sure I want to say it. So I retain the possibility of, pulling that back. But the idea is when Marx said religion is the opiate of the people, what he meant was that because religion had this very redemptive view of suffering, it kept people from saying, we actually need systemic change. We can't just keep going as we are, because religion kept saying, heaven will be great, suffering leads to good things. So one of the best examples of this, all creatures great and small, the hymn.
Song,
Yeah, all things bright and beautiful. So the fourth verse of that, which we take out of the hymn books now, it says this: the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. Right? So Marx was absolutely right.
Yeah.
Religion was being used to keep people under political oppression. And people were told, you have to accept this. And I think that right now, we have so much blame shifting from the people who actually have power to say, you better shape up, you better get your bamboo toothbrush, you need to put all your effort into making sure your life is squeaky clean, otherwise you have no foot to stand on to demand change. We have let environmental activism become our opiate, where we do our little thing, we feel better, and therefore we don't say we need real change that's systemic. That is my most controversial opinion. And you would be better to not do anything personally environmental, but to demand change. Now, ultimately, they work together. I think you should, I think, take the energy you have, put half of it towards getting your bamboo toothbrush, and do the other half, make sure you're doing advocacy. But if you're not doing advocacy because you're spending all your energy on that, it's become an opiate, and it's problematic. How's that?
That's a good controversial opinion. I don't know if it's that controversial, perhaps, maybe. I think that split between doing some personal stuff and some advocacy stuff is what I've heard. I haven't heard it as the opiate of the people, which I think is quite a good phrase.
It's all because Jonathan and I have bamboo toothbrushes.
That was my example long before.
Just teasing. And you've seen them.
That's so funny.
What books are some of your favourite books, your top books, that have formed you, that you've found really influential and inspiring, that you would recommend?
I mentioned Robert Farrar Capon, and his book, The Third Peacock, is his book on suffering. Now, Robert Farrar Capon is Peacock. Robert Farrar Capon is most well known for his theological cookbooks. He's a wild writer, where he really does. He teaches you to cook, and he gets distracted by metaphysics and theology along the way. He's a brilliant writer. He is extremely dated at this point. So he was kind of a controversial edge of your seat, which makes his writing really engaging. But when you read it today, it just seems so misogynistic. But despite that, if you can press through, he's a brilliant writer and really has a good theological sense. He's the one who talked about people being 33 in the resurrection. That's just asking the wrong question, etc., etc. In fact, there he is up on the shelf in this very place.
In this room.
The Parable of Grace. So he's really good. Third Peacock is great. His theological book, cookbook, one of them, The Supper of the Lamb, brilliant. The second one I want to mention is a book by W.H. Vanstone called The Stature of Waiting. And what it is he's talking about the Epistle of Mark, and how in Mark, Jesus starts by doing all the actions. He does all the things. Jesus did, Jesus said, Jesus went, Jesus Jesus healed. But at the moment when he's handed over, and he spends a whole bunch of time kind of talking about the Greek words, it says that he's handed over, not that he's betrayed. There's two different words, and they mean different things. Why does Mark always choose handed over, not betrayed by Jesus? And so he talks about how what it is it's an emphasis on how after that, everything is done to Jesus. Jesus goes from the active party to the one who's the object of all the things. Jesus now doesn't do, but is done to. And talks about that's point where we become the patient, where we become the one who's done to, and the suffering that entails, but also the sort of opportunity. And it's that place where there's that suffering, that literally passion, right? Passion is from the word for suffering, becomes a place where we can encounter God richly, even if we don't want to be there, and so it's a really interesting reflection on sort of the place of the unchosen suffering rather than the chosen suffering. And I think it's a really rich reflection. The third one that I'll mention is by Sarah Williams, and it's called The Shaming of the Strong, or it was republished a few years ago by Plough Publishing called Perfectly Human. And it's a personal memoir of her at the 20-week scan finding out that her baby had thanatophoric dysplasia, a universal dwarfism of the bones that leads to death at the point of birth. And she and her husband Paul decide to take this baby to term and not to abort. But it's not your usual discussion about sort of abortion and where personhood starts at conception. It's nothing like that. It's really their question of, why did this happen? What is the gift and calling of Carrie-Anne, their daughter? And what does it mean to be a valued person when you have no achievements, when you won't even breathe on your own for a moment, when you won't... So it's a sort of rich reflection on personhood, on love for the vulnerable, on what do the most vulnerable in our society and the least able, what are the gifts that they bring to our community? And it's one of those books, like you need 3 boxes of tissues to get through it. I mean, I genuinely remember having difficulty reading it because the tears in my eyes were like coming too fast and I couldn't see through the blurriness. But it has shaped me very deeply, and I think it's a brilliant read. It's very accessible, and yeah, so that's gonna be my top 3.
That last one sounds really intense, and I think I'd like to read it.
It's very intense.
Thank you so much for giving us your time, even though you're only in the country for such a short time. It was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here. And let's do this again if you're willing. It was great.